Leo Maxwell stood in the doorway of his grandfather's apartment, surveying the chaos that had been Edmund Maxwell's life. Towers of yellowed maps leaned precariously against every wall, their edges curling like ancient scrolls. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light streaming through grimy windows, illuminating an obstacle course of measuring instruments, compasses, and half-finished charts that covered every available surface. "Jesus, Grandpa," Leo muttered, stepping carefully over a collection of brass sextants. "How did you live like this?" The apartment smelled of old paper and something else, something that reminded Leo of rainy afternoons and hidden adventures, though he couldn't place why. It had been 3 weeks since Edmund's funeral, a sparsely attended affair that Leo had endured out of obligation rather than grief. They'd barely spoken in the past decade, their relationship strained by Leo's pragmatic worldview and his grandfather's obsession with what he called the city's secret geography. Leo pulled out his phone and began photographing the mess for the estate sale listing. Each picture captured the same story: a man who had lost himself in fantasy, who had chosen imaginary pathways over the real world. As a senior urban planner for the city, Leo dealt in facts, traffic patterns, population density, zoning regulations. His grandfather's romantic notions about hidden territories and lost corners had always struck him as the foolish ramblings of someone who couldn't accept that a city was simply infrastructure and economics, nothing more. The sound of his phone buzzing interrupted his documentation. Sarah Chun, his colleague from the planning department, was calling. "Leo, I hate to ask, but you know the Historical Society Gala next week? They specifically requested something from your grandfather's collection." Apparently, he was quite well known among the local history enthusiasts. Leo looked around the cluttered apartment. Presentable seemed like an impossible standard here.
Fine.
"I'll find something. But I'm not staying for the whole event. You're a lifesaver." Mrs. Henderson mentioned that your grandfather's work was quite unique. She seemed excited about showcasing it. After hanging up, Leo began the tedious process of sorting through the maps. Most were standard city surveys from decades past, but others were more peculiar. Hand-drawn sketches of alleyways that seemed too narrow to exist, detailed studies of architectural features that Leo didn't recognize, and strange notations in his grandfather's spidery handwriting. As he lifted a particularly large map from a stack, something metallic clattered to the floor. Leo bent down and retrieved an old compass, its brass surface tarnished with age. The needle spun wildly when he held it, refusing to settle on magnetic north. Instead, it seemed to dance between different directions, as if responding to some invisible force. "Broken, like everything else in here," Leo said, tossing the compass onto a nearby table. But as he continued sorting, he found himself glancing back at the instrument. Every time he looked, the needle was pointing in a different direction, sometimes spinning slowly, sometimes jerking to a sudden stop. It was probably just a loose bearing, but something about its erratic behavior nagged at him. He selected a relatively clean map of the downtown area, one that showed the main thoroughfares and landmarks that tourists would recognize. As he rolled it carefully, he noticed something strange. The broken compass, when held over certain areas of the map, would suddenly still, its needle pointing with absolute certainty towards specific streets and intersections. Coincidence, Leo told himself, but he couldn't resist testing it again. Each time he moved the compass over the map, it would spin randomly until it passed over what appeared to be unmarked spaces, small courts, narrow alleys, tiny parks that Leo couldn't immediately place despite his professional familiarity with the city. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from his assistant. "Power outage downtown. Estimated 4 to 6 hours. Can you check the Riverside development site? Client wants confirmation that surveying can proceed tomorrow." Leo cursed under his breath. The Riverside site was across town, and with the power out, the subway would be running limited service. As he was about to leave the apartment, he noticed the compass again. On impulse, he slipped it into his pocket along with one of his grandfather's detailed paper maps of the area around the Riverside development. The streets were eerily quiet without the usual hum of electrical infrastructure. Traffic lights were dark, and the few people Leo passed seemed to be moving with the deliberate caution of those navigating unfamiliar territory. His phone's battery was already down to 30%, so he decided to save it and rely on his grandfather's map instead. The map was remarkably detailed, showing not just the major streets but also pedestrian pathways, service alleys, and what appeared to be small courtyards tucked between buildings. Leo had always thought of this part of the city as a straightforward grid, but the map revealed a more complex pattern of interconnected spaces. Following the map's guidance, Leo found himself turning down a narrow passage he'd never noticed before, despite having walked these streets hundreds of times. The passage opened into a small courtyard surrounded by the back walls of office buildings. It was surprisingly quiet, insulated from the city's noise by the surrounding architecture. As he paused to check his location, Leo noticed something carved into the stone wall of one of the buildings, a symbol that looked like an abstract eye surrounded by radiating lines. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, but once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. The compass in his pocket seemed to grow warm against his leg. Leo pulled out the instrument and held it up. The needle pointed directly at the carved symbol, steady and sure. He looked around the courtyard more carefully and spotted two more symbols, each one slightly different but clearly part of the same design vocabulary. The compass responded to each one, its needle swinging to point at them in turn. "What the hell?" Leo whispered. A shadow moved at the edge of his vision. Leo spun around, but saw only an empty archway leading to another narrow passage. For a moment, he was certain someone had been watching him, but when he approached the archway, he found nothing but another quiet courtyard beyond. His phone buzzed with a low battery warning. Leo hurried through the remaining streets to the Riverside site, completed his survey, and made his way home as the sun began to set. But throughout the evening, he couldn't stop thinking about the symbols and the compass's strange behavior. That night, Leo spread his grandfather's maps across his dining table and began examining them more closely. With a magnifying glass, he could see that the strange symbols appeared throughout the collection, sometimes barely visible in the margins, sometimes incorporated into the decorative elements of the map borders. They were everywhere, but so subtle that you'd miss them unless you were specifically looking. He tried holding the compass over different maps, and each time, it would point to locations where these symbols appeared. More intriguingly, when he checked these locations against modern city maps, they corresponded to real places, forgotten courtyards, narrow alleys, small parks that existed but were rarely visited or noticed. The next morning, Leo received a call from Dr. Marcus Webb, a professor from the university's cartography department. "Mr. Maxwell, I was sorry to hear about your grandfather's passing. Edmund was a remarkable man, quite ahead of his time in terms of experiential mapping and urban phenomenology." Leo had no idea what those terms meant, but he sensed an opportunity. "Thank you, Dr. Webb. I'm actually in the process of cataloging his collection. Perhaps you'd be interested in discussing its academic value?" "Absolutely. Edmund's work represents a fascinating intersection of traditional cartography and what we might call psychogeography, the study of how urban environments affect human behavior and experience. His theoretical framework was quite revolutionary, actually." Theoretical framework. Leo felt a familiar sense of relief. His grandfather's obsessions could be explained away as academic abstractions, nothing more than intellectual exercises. The symbols, the compass, the strange courtyards, all of it was probably just Edmund's way of exploring urban theory, not actual discovery. "I'd be happy to discuss it further," Leo said. "I'm presenting one of his maps at the Historical Society Gala next week." "Wonderful. I'll be attending that event myself. I'm giving a presentation on the forgotten corners of our city, quite timely given Edmund's interests." As the week progressed, Leo found himself taking detours through the city, following the paths suggested by his grandfather's maps. Each route led him through spaces he'd never noticed, intimate courtyards, narrow passages between buildings, small parks tucked away from main thoroughfares. The compass continued its strange behavior, pointing toward architectural details that incorporated the recurring symbols. He began to see the city differently. What had once seemed like a straightforward urban grid now revealed itself as a complex network of hidden connections. The symbols appeared in the most unexpected places, carved into old lampposts, worked into the designs of manhole covers, subtly integrated into the stonework of building facades. The night before the gala, Leo carefully cleaned the map he'd selected for display. As he worked, he noticed that some of the stains weren't stains at all, but faint markings that had been covered by years of accumulated grime. Under careful cleaning, these markings became visible as delicate annotations in his grandfather's handwriting, coordinates, measurements, and cryptic notes that seemed to reference the mysterious symbols. Leo arrived at the Historical Society Gala with a growing sense of unease. The event was being held in the ballroom of an old hotel, its walls lined with displays of local artifacts and historical documents. His grandfather's map had been given a place of honor in the center of the room, illuminated by professional lighting that made its details remarkably clear. The usual crowd was there: local historians, city officials, and the kind of people who attended cultural events out of social obligation rather than genuine interest. Leo nursed a glass of wine and waited for an appropriate moment to make his excuses and leave. Dr. Webb approached him during the cocktail hour. "Mr. Maxwell, I'm delighted to see Edmund's work displayed so prominently. The map you've chosen is particularly significant. It covers an area that's undergone tremendous change over the past century." "I'm still learning about his methods," Leo admitted. "Some of his notations are quite cryptic." Before Leo could respond, the evening's program began. Mrs. Henderson, the Historical Society's president, welcomed the guests and introduced Dr. Webb as the keynote speaker. His presentation was titled "The Forgotten Corners of Our City: Hidden Histories in Plain Sight." Leo settled into his chair, expecting the usual dry, academic discourse. Instead, Dr. Webb began with a series of photographs that made Leo's blood run cold. They were images of the same courtyards he'd discovered while following his grandfather's maps, the same narrow passages, the same architectural details he'd been noticing all week. "What you're seeing," Dr. Webb explained, "are spaces that exist in our city, but somehow remain invisible to most residents. They're not secret in any legal sense. They're accessible. They appear on official maps. They're maintained by city services. But they occupy a strange liminal space in our collective consciousness." The presentation continued with more photographs, each one showing details that Leo recognized: the carved symbols, the unusual architectural features, the quiet courtyards that seem to exist outside the normal flow of urban life. "These spaces form what we might call a shadow geography," Dr. Webb continued. "They're connected not just physically, but conceptually. They represent a different way of understanding urban space, not as a grid of efficient pathways, but as a network of experiences and discoveries." Leo felt his mouth go dry. This wasn't academic theory. It was a perfect description of what he'd been experiencing all week. Dr. Webb gestured toward the display area. "And it seems that we have a direct connection to this forgotten history right here with us tonight." He looked directly at Leo. "Mr. Maxwell, would you join me at your grandfather's map?" Leo stood on unsteady legs and walked to the display. The map seemed to glow under the professional lighting, its details sharper than he'd ever seen them. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Webb announced, "Edmund Maxwell was not just a cartographer. He was a visionary who spent decades documenting what he called the secret city within the city. What you see here is not simply a map, but a guide to experiencing urban space in an entirely new way." Dr. Webb pulled out a device that looked like a UV light. "With Mr. Maxwell's permission, I'd like to demonstrate something remarkable about this particular map." Leo nodded, though he wasn't sure what he was agreeing to. Dr. Webb switched on the UV light and held it over the map. Immediately, hidden lines became visible, delicate tracery that connected the various symbols and landmarks in an intricate network. The lines glowed softly under the ultraviolet illumination, revealing a pattern that transformed the familiar city geography into something entirely new. The audience gasped collectively. Leo stared at the map in shock, recognizing the pathways he'd been following all week, the connections he'd been sensing but couldn't quite articulate. "This is Edmund's masterpiece," Dr. Webb explained. "A map that reveals the hidden architecture of human experience in urban space. The symbols you see are markers, not just geographical references. but invitations to discovery. Leo pulled the compass from his pocket without thinking. As he held it over the illuminated map, the needle spun once and then pointed directly at one of the glowing pathways. And there, Dr. Webb said with obvious delight, is the key to reading the map. Edmund designed it to be interactive, to guide the user through a journey of urban discovery. The compass responds to magnetic materials embedded in the map itself, a technique he developed to create what he called directed serendipity. The room erupted in excited chatter. Leo stood frozen, staring at the map that had transformed from a simple geographical document into something that seemed almost alive. The network of glowing lines pulsed gently, as if powered by some internal rhythm. The remarkable thing, Dr. Webb continued, is that Edmund believed only certain people would be able to fully appreciate and utilize his work. He often spoke of a kindred spirit who would understand both the practical and the poetic aspects of urban exploration. Leo felt tears welling up in his eyes. For the first time, he understood what his grandfather had been trying to show him all those years. The city wasn't just infrastructure and economics, it was a living network of stories, experiences, and possibilities. Every street corner held potential discoveries, every alleyway offered a chance to see familiar territory with new eyes. Mrs. Henderson approached with obvious excitement. "Mr. Maxwell, this is extraordinary. Would you consider allowing us to create a permanent exhibition of your grandfather's work? This could completely change how people experience our city." Leo looked at the map, still glowing under the UV light, and then at the faces of the audience, people who had been as surprised as he was by the revelation of the hidden city. He thought about his grandfather's cluttered apartment, which he'd planned to clear out and sell. Instead, he could see it transformed into a gallery space, a place where people could come to understand Edmund's vision. "I think," Leo said slowly, "that's exactly what he would have wanted." Over the following weeks, Leo found himself spending more and more time in his grandfather's apartment, cataloging the maps and instruments, beginning to understand the scope of Edmund's work. Each map revealed new layers of meaning, new connections between the city's visible and invisible geographies. The audience gasped collectively. Leo stared at the map in shock, recognizing the pathways he'd been following all week, the connections he'd been sensing but couldn't quite articulate. "This is Edmund's masterpiece," Dr. Webb explained. "A map that reveals the hidden architecture of human experience in urban space. The symbols you see are markers, not just geographical references, but invitations to discovery." Leo pulled the compass from his pocket without thinking. As he held it over the illuminated map, the needle spun once and then pointed directly at one of the glowing pathways. "And there," Dr. Webb said with obvious delight, "is the key to reading the map." Edmund designed it to be interactive, to guide the user through a journey of urban discovery. The compass responds to magnetic materials embedded in the map itself, a technique he developed to create what he called directed serendipity. The room erupted in excited chatter. Leo stood frozen, staring at the map that had transformed from a simple geographical document into something that seemed almost alive. The network of glowing lines pulsed gently, as if powered by some internal rhythm. The remarkable thing, Dr. Webb continued, is that Edmund believed only certain people would be able to fully appreciate and utilize his work. He often spoke of a kindred spirit who would understand both the practical and the poetic aspects of urban exploration. Leo felt tears welling up in his eyes. For the first time, he understood what his grandfather had been trying to show him all those years. The city wasn't just infrastructure and economics, it was a living network of stories, experiences, and possibilities. Every street corner held potential discoveries, every alleyway offered a chance to see familiar territory with new eyes. Mrs. Henderson approached with obvious excitement. "Mr. Maxwell, this is extraordinary. Would you consider allowing us to create a permanent exhibition of your grandfather's work? This could completely change how people experience our city." Leo looked at the map, still glowing under the UV light, and then at the faces of the audience, people who had been as surprised as he was by the revelation of the hidden city. He thought about his grandfather's cluttered apartment, which he'd planned to clear out and sell. Instead, he could see it transformed into a gallery space, a place where people could come to understand Edmund's vision. I think, Leo said slowly, that's exactly what he would have wanted. Over the following weeks, Leo found himself spending more and more time in his grandfather's apartment, cataloging the maps and instruments, beginning to understand the scope of Edmund's work. Each map revealed new layers of meaning, new connections between the city's visible and invisible geographies. He began incorporating his grandfather's insights into his own planning work, advocating for the preservation and enhancement of the forgotten spaces that Edmund had documented. The narrow courtyards became pocket parks, the hidden passages became pedestrian shortcuts, the overlooked architectural details became focal points for urban revitalization. The compass became Leo's constant companion, guiding him through the city's secret pathways. Sometimes it would point toward a courtyard where he'd discover a community garden maintained by local residents. Other times it would lead him to historical markers that had been overlooked for decades. Always, it revealed connections he'd never noticed before. The exhibition of Edmund's work opened 6 months later in the apartment that had once seemed like chaos, but now felt like a doorway to infinite possibility. Visitors came not just to see the maps, but to experience the city differently. They borrowed copies of Edmund's guides and set off on their own journeys of discovery, following the pathways between the visible and invisible city. Leo stood in the exhibition space one evening, watching a group of children trace the glowing lines on one of the illuminated maps. Their excitement reminded him of something he'd lost and found again, the sense that the world was full of mysteries waiting to be discovered, that even the most familiar places could surprise you if you knew how to look. The compass sat on a display table nearby, its needle pointing toward the window and the city beyond. Leo picked it up and felt its familiar weight in his hand. Outside, the evening light was beginning to fade, and the city's hidden geography was preparing to reveal itself to those who knew how to see it. He thought about his grandfather, about the years of misunderstanding and missed opportunities, about the legacy that had been waiting for him all along. The city spread out before him like a vast map, its secrets no longer hidden but simply waiting for the right moment to be discovered. The compass needle spun once and settled, pointing toward a pathway Leo had never explored. He smiled, pocketed the instrument, and headed for the door. The city was calling, and he finally knew how to answer.